thank you very much to the library for hosting me, and thanks to Kim, the director of the Carpenter's Boat Shop, for helping arrange all this. It's great to be here. So the ground rules are, we're never too old for show and tell, so I've got a table of Japanese boat building tools. I think just about, well, almost everything there is specific to boat building, and not other Japanese carpentry trades. I also have brought copies of my book, and I will be selling that after the talk. So, and I'm going to move through sort of chronologically my work in Japan. But also if you have a question, just feel free to shout out or raise your hand. I'm happy to be interrupted to answer questions. People often take this talk in interesting directions. So we'll begin with a map that was drawn by a member of our audience, Rumline Maps and Benjamin Meter of South Bristol. This is from my book, and this shows my first 5 apprenticeships in Japan, which is what my book covers. I have done now 7 apprenticeships in Japan since 1996. I'm the sole apprentice for 6 of my 7 teachers. My most recent teacher had 1 apprentice 40 years ago. So my first apprenticeship was here on Sato Island. We also have somebody in the audience who did a 2-year traditional music apprenticeship on Sato Island. And my second and third apprenticeships were here in Tokyo Bay, Urayasu, and Tokyo itself. My 4th apprenticeship was way up in Aomori, which is Maine's sister state. And my 5th apprenticeship was down here in Okinawa. And then what doesn't show on the map, in 2015, I went to where the tsunami zone, where the tsunami struck this coastline, and I apprenticed with the last boat builder, the last working boat builder on that coast. And then 1 year ago, a little over a year ago, I was right here in the middle of the country, and it was my first freshwater boat apprenticeship. And I was working with an 85-year-old boat builder building a cormorant fishing boat. You'll see all of these. So we'll go right to it. I got over to Japan simply because my college roommate was from Hiroshima, and he spent the 10 years after we graduated from college twisting my arm to come visit his native country. And when I told him I'd left my job at the Maritime Museum in San Francisco, 2 weeks later I got a plane ticket with a note on it that said, "Now you have no excuses." And so I went to Japan. I kind of entered my career as a boat builder. It's what I wanted to keep doing. And again, I started through museums. I did my first boat at Mystic Seaport, and then I was working at the Maritime Museum in San Francisco. So I was very versed in curating boats and lines taking of historic boats and interviewing boat builders. So that's kind of where I was going as a boat builder. But I went to Japan just as a backpacker and a Lonely Planet travel guide telling me what temples to go see and so on. But right before I left, a friend of mine gave me a photo from a magazine that showed a very unusual boat. And when I got to Hiroshima to see my college roommate, I said, "What's this caption say?" And he read it, and he said, "It says Ogi Village, Sato Island." And so I decided to go there because the boats intrigued me. And I really didn't think I would find these boats when I got to Sato Island. But that is the first photograph I took my first morning on the island. This was just down the hill from the youth hospital in Ogi Village. And what you're seeing, these are called taragune, which means tub boat. And these are still used for fishing on Sato Island. These happen to be tourist boats. But in the small villages, probably this one over here is an actual fisherman's boat. And then there's the standard fishing boat on Sato Island that's either 19 or 21 feet long. But there's a very interesting history of these boats. Actually, these are traditionally used by women. So fisher persons, they use a wooden box with a glass bottom. They have a collection of spears. They steady the boat with their paddle in one hand. They hold the box with their head, and they grab the spear and they reach down. These bamboo spears are 20, 30 feet long, and they reach down and grab a variety of shellfish. That hook is for abalone, this is for sazae, and this sickle is for wakame, seaweed. You slice the seaweed, and as it floats free, you catch it with the back of your blade and pull it up to the surface. And this kind of fishing is actually a different verb in Japanese called isonegi, negiru, to harvest or gather from the bottom. So this is very prevalent all around Japan, kind of harvesting off the bottom. But Sado Island is the only place that uses tugboats. Here's a woman paddling into shore. You see why this fishing works. The waters are crystal clear. Notice the boats aren't round, they're oval. And also notice she is paddling from the bow. Okay? So, needless to say, an odd little boat. This is classic Japanese barrel making. And so on my first trip, there were actually still 2 boat builders active who could build these boats. By my second trip to Japan, one of them had passed away. So the last living builder of these boats, he and I developed a relationship. I went and visited him 3 times, in 1990, 92, and 94. And at the end of my 3rd visit, he invited me to be his apprentice. And by that point, I had hired interpreters in Tokyo and taken them out to Sado so I could interview Mr. Fujii. And what I discovered was he really had an inability to describe in words what he did. And so as we both struggled through these interview meetings and trying to document his work, what became apparent to me was, I'll never get this through a give and take of an interview. And so the only way to document this craft is to get inside it as an apprentice. So in 1996, and one village famously uses outboard motors. But notice how he steers it, still from the bow. By the way, pardon me?
They use like a sculling stroke in the bow?
Yes, it's a figure-8 stroke. And the tugboat survives to this day. If you look at this coastline, that's an uplift of the volcanic bottom from an earthquake in the mid-1800s. I think the bottom around Sado, the Ogi Peninsula, rose like 16 feet in this massive earthquake. And what that created was, this photo isn't as real, it's a very complicated shoreline. And if you imagine a sea in there, you can't get a conventional boat in there. It'll just be smashed to pieces on the rocks. And so the tugboat filled this niche because it's perfect for maneuvering in there, bouncing off the rocks, and it's felt that the best catch is close inshore. And it also changed the culture of this part of Sado Island because suddenly a fishing family could have a second boat. And so Mom came out of the kitchen and came out of the rice field, and now she was out fishing too. So there's a real big sociological change around this. And like I say, they're a very affordable boat. So they're still somewhat popular. These are my teacher's tools for building the boat. These are the classic patterns used by barrel makers. And you'll see the slide a little bit later, but you can if you look at this one here, that is giving you the outside curvature of the stave and the proper angle for the edge. And the other curve, the back of that pattern, is giving you the inside curvature of the stave. Okay? So if you meet a Japanese barrel maker, he's got one of these for every size bucket and barrel he or she makes. Okay? And so my teacher actually was a 3rd generation cooper. And his grandfather and father built these miso tubs. This is the Marodai Miso Company in Hamochi, Sado Island. These are about 10 feet tall. So these are huge, huge coopered objects. And you notice the braided bamboo hoops. This is the toughest part about building these boats. But my teacher spent, till age 56, he spent his career in the cooperage like his father and grandfather. But really, he told me, really all he did was make replacement hoops. So some of these barrels are over 100 years old. He was working on his grandfather's barrels. But then he decided to retire early and build tugboats. So my apprenticeship. The first day of my apprenticeship, eager to prove myself, I wanted to jump right in and get to work. And I was a bit chagrined because my teacher pointed to a stool in the shop and said, "Sit." And like all of my teachers, he forbade speaking in the workshop. There was no speaking allowed. And that has been consistent through all my apprenticeships. I've been told that up front the first day by most of my teachers. You will not speak. You will not talk to me. And the only dispensation was we were allowed to talk at cigarette break and lunch. And that was it. So this did afford me a great vantage point to photograph the work. But for 2.5 days, I sat and watched. And at the end of the day, he would get up, he would point to the floor, and he would say, clean, and he would walk out. So I heard 2 words my first day, sit and clean. And then I heard 1 word my second day, clean. And then finally, halfway through my 3rd day, he was planing staves, sitting on the floor. Most Japanese craftspeople work on the floor. He's holding the work with his feet. He has kind of a workbench with a stop that he can brace it against. He's got his round bottom planes. And he jumped up and he told me to sit here, and then he said, work. And he walked out of the shop. So I expected he was going out to have a cigarette and he'd be back to supervise me, but he never came back. So I started to make staves. And I kept looking, out the barn door, and no Mr. Fuji. My wife told me later she found him taking a nap. So after a couple of hours, he reappeared, he took my pile of staves, and he segregated them. And he said, good, bad, good, good, bad, 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 good. And then he pointed to the bad pile and said, fix them, then clean the shop. And he left. All right? He didn't tell me what was wrong with the bad staves. Okay? But I tell this anecdote, and it was instructional for me, of course, because this is the nature of the Japanese apprenticeship. And in Japan, the belief is the way to learn a craft is by observation. Okay? The typical boat building apprenticeship was 6 years in Japan. You might very well spend the first year doing nothing but sweeping. But the apprentice who is sweeping is always got one eye on the master and what they're doing. Because when the day comes and you are asked to do something, you are expected to do it perfectly. Okay.
Could I just interject? You're talking about me, not I.
Oh yeah, yes, yeah, that's the phrase.
It's just a beautiful example of that. And it's a Japanese way, not just for crafts learning, but and learning anything. Learning by watching, by looking, by taking it first.
Right.
So it's wonderful the way you're elucidating this.
Thank you. And it's interesting because remember I was given a chance to talk and ask questions, and that really came up against a failure, because when I would ask questions, I would get one of 2 answers. Mite wakaru, matte wakaru. And those mean watch and you will understand, or wait and you will understand. Okay? Because one of the other things in the Japanese apprenticeship is the master, and this is true like on a temple construction site, the regular carpenter does not presume to know the overall project. The regular carpenter is expected to just know his or her task. The foreman, the oyakata, or torio, is the one who has all the information. And it's true in the apprenticeship that the master parcels out the information only as it's needed. And you are not expected to think ahead, ask ahead, wonder what's coming. That's not your place. Your place is to move logically, at the master's designated pace. So we'll tell more stories about apprenticeship as we go along. But needless to say, for me, this was completely shocking. And it also brought up another issue, which was secrecy. Because a master did not always teach everything to his apprentice, or show everything to his apprentice. And in fact, Mr. Fuji told me he apprenticed at age 56 with the island's most famous tugboat builder. And he told me that he used to sneak into his master's shop at night with a candle and study his layout, because his master wouldn't show it to him. And he said, I actually found out, I realized that my master was snapping lines that made no sense. He was trying to throw me off. And I've heard that story several times from boatbuilders. And there's a very famous phrase in Japan. If you ever meet a Japanese craftsperson, throw out the phrase, nusumi gekko. Nusumu is the verb to steal. The gekko means lesson. Stolen lessons. And so if your master wasn't your father or your mother, there was no guarantee they were going to teach you anything. Only family members had a vested interest in bringing you, the apprentice, full in. But in other cases where you weren't a member of the family, you had to steal your master's secrets. That's completely understood in Japanese crafts. But so that sounds rough, but part of that Japanese learning ethic is what sounds like a barrier, what sounds cruel to you, is yet another part of the lesson, right? And what I like to say is, this is a values-based education. This is about learning qualities of perseverance, observation, concentration, willingness, passion. And that gets taught right up front. So this is splitting the bamboo with his homemade bamboo splitter. We went and cut 60-foot tall timber bamboo. It gets split into 8 strips. They get shaped. He's actually pulling the strips. He's bracing the draw knife with his feet. And then you begin to braid the hoops. So the day came to braid the hoops. And Mr. Fuji, this is 4 strips of bamboo, about 50 to 60 feet long. You can't change its size. It has to be braided exactly the right size. The tugboat is slightly tapered, so the 3 hoops are a slightly different size to fit tight exactly where they're supposed to go. So Mr. Fuji started a hoop with 2 strips, dropped it in my lap, and walked away, and started to braid these hoops. I had the presence of mind. I brought my first video camera on this apprenticeship, and my wife filmed Mr. Fuji. And I struggled, and with a bit of his help, I struggled through my 1 hoop. But in fact, I came home and stuck my video in the video player, and I probably watched that video 100 times with plastic strapping in my hand, and I finally figured out how to braid the hoops. And in a sense, I replicated that 6-year apprenticeship, sitting in front of my television set, going over and over and over again. Now again, you might accuse this of being inefficient, and it is inefficient. I could teach every one of you in a half hour how to braid one of those hoops. The difference is, if you came back here in a year, if we gathered here in a year, how many of you would remember how to do it? And what I like to say is, you could get me drunk, put a paper bag over my head, spin me around and round and round, but if you put 4 pieces of bamboo in my hand, I could braid a hoop. But it's not really a laugh line. It's what I'm talking about is the intensity of this form of instruction, which is not just powered by the way the master treats you, but quickly is powered from within yourself. Like, how do I do this? I've got to learn this, is pretty amazing. And I do like to say that there's nothing I know better how to do than braid a bamboo barrel. So here are the tourist boats. My teacher was very proud of having made the first glass bottom tugboat. He made this whole fleet before he passed away. There we are, getting the planing inside of the staves. And then small slide. That's our boat that we built together. I never saw my teacher again. He passed away, he died in an accident a couple years later. And a foundation on the island, the Kodo Cultural Foundation, called me and said, "You're his only apprentice, what do we do?" And so I said, well, we're going to do the traditional thing, and I'm going to teach an apprentice. So there's my apprentice, a carpenter from Sado Island. He and I built 2 tugboats together. And then I said, we're going to do the Western thing. and you're going to publish my research. And so this is my book. It's in English and Japanese, The Tugboats of Sado Island. It's essentially the same text as the section in my book, my big book, and it is bilingual. And to talk a bit about documentation in Japan, this is arguably the first how-to boat building book ever published in Japan. Because in Japanese culture, that's not how you learn a craft. This is our prejudice that you go to YouTube, that you buy a DVD, that you subscribe to a magazine, that you read a bunch of books on boat building. That's our Western prejudice. That does not exist in Japanese culture. The way you learn a craft in Japan is you find a master. Yes?
Why did most of your masters not have apprentices?
So most of my masters, they were in their 70s and 80s when I worked with them. They came of age at the end of World War II. The country was completely destroyed. There were no opportunities. And so they went into, in most cases, went into the boat shop, their father's boat shops. So that generation grew up. Interestingly, most of my teachers have sons and daughters my age. But think about it. I graduated from high school in 1978. By 1980, Japan was the world's second largest economy. So their children grew up in this absolute onrush of wealth and possibility and corporate growth. So they all moved to the cities. And so all across Japanese crafts, there was a missing generation of apprentices. And this is what has propelled my research, is the fact that without a generation of apprentices, all the knowledge would be lost. Because nothing's written down. On purpose. Again, we've been writing things down since Diderot wrote the encyclopedia, right? That's not a Japanese tradition. These are my drawings, first published drawings of a tugboat, and these are all my teacher's dimensions in shaku. And I have a shaku tape measure here and a shaku square, which is a traditional Japanese measuring system. It's a decimal system, and the beauty of it is one shaku is 11 and 15/16 inches. So for those of us who can't think in metric, because otherwise Japan is completely metric, technically shaku is illegal in Japan. That's how hard they tried to switch to metric. But there are a lot of crafts, especially in the countryside, that still, rural house carpenters still use shaku. There is no such thing as a metric kimono. Kimono makers have absolutely refused to abandon the shaku system. Yes?
I have a question, being a boat person myself. What is the stability like in that type of boat?
Oh, these are actually surprisingly stable, amazingly stable. Though when you're riding it, you carry a stone as a counterweight. So you're at one end and you have a rock at the other end. But otherwise, they're amazingly stable. So, and here's the step-by-step from left to right of how to braid the hoops. That is also the rarest skill I possess. I'd say there's probably only 24 people in Japan that know how to braid barrel hoops. The barrel making coopering has almost vanished at this point. So, in fact, Japan's few coopers, several of them have contacted me, young coopers. They got their start reading my book. Yeah.
What was our material where you made little knots in between the hoops and the braid?
Oh, here?
Yes.
So when I braid it, for a beginner to braid a hoop, I tell them to tie your crossings. Because just the twine, and then you cut that off later. It helps keep the openings consistent. My teacher didn't need to do that, though. And there I am on Lake Champlain. In my
Have they moved to steel bands?
No. Now, the next apprenticeship was, this is Tokyo Bay. This photograph was taken in 1964 and shows the sailing fleet of seaweed boats. And this now has all vanished. Pollution destroyed this whole fishery. The bay there was filled in. That's the mouth of the Sakai River at the top of the photograph. The current mouth of the Sakai River is over 2 miles further out into Tokyo Bay. This was all filled in after the fisheries were destroyed from pollution. And what sits out there now is Tokyo Disneyland. So if you stand on this bridge today, you can see Magic Mountain and Mickey Mouse. But I was lucky enough, the town of Urayasu created a museum, and there was one boat builder left from this era of wooden boat building. And he donated his father's tools, which you see in the display cases. And they created a museum boat shop. And they asked him for the opening in the museum to build one of these iconic seaweed boats. And it completely shocked me. But he said, I will not do it unless I can teach the American. And what shocked me about that was I had met him once, and it was a very frosty meeting. He had no interest in talking to me and threw me out, essentially. He said, you have to go now, get lost. And I wrote him a thank you letter, and I followed up with some other information, maybe my first article in Wooden Boat on the tugboats, things like that. And then 3 years later, I get this letter from the museum director. You have to come because Mr. Utagawa won't build a boat without you. So, a bit of lofting. This is Mr. Utagawa's drawing of the seaweed boat. Very typical boat builders do a 1/10 scale drawing on a plank of wood, never on paper. This is my paper copy. And what you see is the profile of the boat here, the plan view of the bottom, and the expanded transom. And it's all well and good, except for the fact that you can't build a boat from it. My apprentices who are studying lofting, why not? What's missing?
Any kind of scale.
No, it's 1/10 scale.
1/10 scale.
You have the plan view of the bottom, but you do not have the plan view of the chine or the shear. And if you ask the boat builder, why are they missing, he'll say, those are my secrets. So here is my drawing of the same boat, and there are the two missing lines. Okay? This is Mr. Utagawa. We made patterns, we made wooden patterns for the angle of the stem and the angle of the transom. The angle of the garboard at one station and the angle of the garboard at another station. These were made out of scrap wood. And Mr. Utagawa told me, after I build a boat, I burn those. And he built 300 of these in his career. And this is all in shock, all the dimensions. So this is the boat. So again, you work on the floor on low horses. The building itself is a very important tool because you have to prop everything to the frame of your shop. And then you notice here that these are mortises for nails. In the West, we send a fastening through the plank into a frame. Most Japanese boats don't have any frames, internal framing. So the planks are edge nailed to each other. Okay? So we'll get a little bit more on that.
What is the wood?
This is all cedar. The stem and the beams were Japanese nutmeg, which was unique to Urayasu, no place else. This is my teacher in Tokyo, and he's using a very, very common tool to set an angle. We're setting the angle of the garboard plank. You can see where we burned it to bend it. There's no use of steam in Japan. You bend over an open fire. And this tool is a stick, and one shaku back from the end of the stick is a mark. You hang a boat nail as a plumb bob, and every angle is remembered as a horizontal dimension from the string to the one shaku mark. So that's how all angles are recorded. And he was not a Boston Red Sox fan. When I told him what that hat meant, he said, "That's a very strange name for a baseball." All right, and now these are the saws that are specific to boat building, because one of the next techniques, and I have a selection of these saws, what makes them unique is this curved back, which allows you to fit in tight spaces. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And this is one of the hardest techniques in Japanese boat building. You set up So when you build a strake out of multiple pieces of wood, you set up your planks on the shop floor and you run a series of saw cuts between them. Now you probably know that trick. If you want to make two pieces of wood fit, you can saw between it and move it together. This is a lot more complicated. And you use a series of saws and go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So here are the two side planks to our boat, and they're going to be composed of 3 pieces of wood. And we've already cut the mortises for our edge nails. And that seam, that would easily be a day's work for one person. Traveling back and forth with the saw cut. And let's see what. And then you get ready to nail. These are the flat steel. These are all handmade. Boat nails in Japan are all handmade, and they're flat steel. And because they're flat steel, you can't pilot them with a drill, and so you use a special set of chisels called tsubanomi. And I have a selection here, and the tsuba is the hilt. And so you pound this into the wood, and you need to hit the hilt to get it back out. And so we are piloting holes, my teacher and I. And there you see the mortise. It goes half the depth of the plank. The nail will come up through there, exit there. It's a rectangular hole, which you can cut with that chisel, and it will join to the other plank. And that's a cutaway. And note the fit between the planks. Japanese boats are built without caulking. Only old boats get caulked when they loosen up with age. I have some Japanese caulking here. It's the inner bark of the cypress tree, not cotton. You can take a look at this. I think there's now only one source in Japan for this material. But after doing the saw fitting, the final step before putting the planks together is you take a hammer and you pound the facing edges, you compress the wood fibers, and then when the plank is nailed together and the boat goes in the water, all those fibers bounce back in that seam that was tightly fitted to begin with, and so that's it. It's considered incredible shame to launch a boat in Japan and have a drop of water inside. And that, the apex of the square is on this. I know this is a little out of focus, but the apex of the square is on the seam between 2 pieces of wood. Well, it's there, but it's a good fit. Okay, and then building the boat, again the props all around, you see the chart planking, you see these enormously wide strakes that are made up of more than one plank that are edge nailed together. This is our boat in Tokyo. And this was an interesting moment in Tokyo. This was kind of unique. One day, my teacher said to me, there's something you have to learn. And he said, and then he really had my attention when he said, you can't call yourself a boat builder unless you know this. It's called nawa no sumi. Nawa no sumi means basically string marking. It's a lofting technique. So he took this piece of wood, again, everything's drawn on wood, and he took his straight edge and he started to draw these lines in complete silence while I watched. And he drew the lines, just took him a few seconds. And when he was done, he looked at me and he said, "Do you understand that?" And I said, "No." And he made a face. And he took his plane, and you can see where he planed his lines off. And he drew them again, exact same lines. And he looked at me and he said, "Do you understand now?" And I said, "No." And he looked down and he said, "Get back to work." And he never mentioned it again. And at break time, I took this piece of wood and I ran to the convenience store and I put it down on the copy machine. I copied it. And I would get this out And I would get this out periodically and study it, and about 2 years later, I figured it out. But the moral of that story is his opening line: you can't call yourself a boat builder if you don't know this. And so, another lesson about Japanese education is the responsibility is put entirely on the student. And I realize, teaching in America, the ways in which students come into the classroom like this: give it to me. And in Japan, and I say this to my college class, the teacher does not teach, but the student is required to learn. And that is a dynamic that's kind of interesting and worth sitting with. And what that changes everything, really, in the relationship. And I really do say that for my teachers, it was like benign neglect. I know Mr. Fujiwara really cared about me. I know I was probably like a son to him. But I didn't get it. That's my problem. It's not his responsibility. It's my responsibility to figure out what I need to do to get it. And if it takes 2 years, that's great. So, anyway, there's our Tokyo boat finished. And you can go row that in Tokyo. Get in touch with me. There's a nonprofit we donated. The foundation that funded this project donated the boat to a nonprofit that will teach you traditional rowing in a canal in Tokyo. They have a fleet of traditional boats. So up north in Aomori, this is my teacher. He used no drawings whatsoever. He built entirely from memory. He had a few patterns for plank angles. The notations was stuff only he understood. And here we are. The garboard is propped in place, top and bottom, even propped to the sidewall, and he is moving down the garboard seam with the handsaw. Back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth. And there, I'm doing the garboard seam, and he's using the tip of the saw and getting the rabbet, fitting the rabbet. Okay? And the carving. I was lucky, he's the last working boat builder in Aomori, and it turned out there's a lot of carving on boats, fishing boats in northern Japan, and it turned out the tradition of carving in his village was greater than any place else. So he sat down and carved these motifs on separate planks, and then we put those planks on there. And it was very interesting because later, this is launch day, later there's some carving at the bow as well. Later I went through my notes before I left, and it turned out 1/6 of the total labor in this boat was carving. And as apprentice, it was my job to paint. But, and I said to him, you know, this is a fishing boat. And I said to him, you know, Mr. Ando, what, like, I don't get this. Why would you devote that much labor to this carving? And here's a man with a cell phone and a satellite disk and all the trappings of modern life. And he looked at me and he said, no fisherman in this village would go to sea without those motifs on his boat. And in fact, if you go to Shironuka today, even the big steel fishing trawlers have a carved wooden board on the side of the wheelhouse with those motifs. And now down in Okinawa, and this is a very interesting phenomenon because this is the first example in Japan of a traditional fishing boat being rediscovered as a pleasure boat and sparking a revival. The only revival in boat building is happening right now in Okinawa. So this is the Sabani, traditional Okinawan fishing boat, sailed and paddled, and these disappeared soon after World War II. But yachtsmen and board sailors and surfers kind of discovered them. And 15 years ago, they started a racing series. And there are now 35 Sabani racing teams. And there were 3 men in their 80s who were the last boat builders in Okinawa. And the teams put them all back in business. And I apprenticed with one of those 3 men. So we were talking about this, and he was telling me, he said, yeah, it was funny when I got the first commission to build a Sabani racing boat. He said, because I hadn't built, my first thought was, I hadn't built a Sabani in 30 years. And so my first fear was, did I remember all the dimensions? So he said, so I got out a piece of plywood for each of my 4 designs, and I sketched the boat, and I wrote down the memorized dimensions. And that's almost the only example I've seen of a boat builder documenting himself. And yet, and I ran into these to the copy store. I copied all these. But what turned out happening was I discovered some of these dimensions are inside of planking and some of them are outside. So this is still a puzzle. But I figured it out, but it was still a puzzle. He didn't bother to make that notation. And so a Sabani is a semi-dugout. It's made of extremely thick timbers that are fastened together and then carved to their final shape. So we're looking at the 2 side planks. These 2 side planks were 2 inches thick, 30 inches wide, and 28 feet long. Okay? And if you look closely, this is full thickness at the gunnel, and then it's carved to half its depth. And then it comes up to full thickness here as a thwart riser for the floorboards, basically. And then it's carved again to half its depth, and then it rises up to full thickness at the garboard seam where it's going to join the bottom. So then we bend them slowly. The Okinawans are the only people in Japan that build small boats upside down. Bent them. I spent 3 days spraying hot water on these planks while my teacher tightened these temporary turn buckles. And then we dropped the bottom on. The bottom was 3 enormous chunks of cedar that we fastened together, although he told me in his younger days he could get a bottom out of 1 piece. And then you start to carve that. See the bottom's off to the left. We would use a chain fall and bring it over and try to fit it to the sides. All right? But one of the main reasons I wanted to go to Okinawa was to learn the fastening method. These boats are built without any metal fastenings. They're fastened entirely with these bamboo nails, spikes, and these hardwood keys. So there's my teacher cutting them out of the bandsaw. So here's how you do it. There's the 2 planks, the seam between them. You lay your key down and trace it. You label your key, that's me, making sure I don't make a mistake, key number 4. And then with a drill, you kind of get most of the wood out, and then you chisel it. And here's the magic of how it works. If you look closely, I haven't finished chiseling to the top and bottom, but I chisel from the outer corner to just inside my pencil line in the middle, all the way around. See that? And what that does is, if you can visualize this, when that hardwood key goes in, those act like 4 wedges sucking the 2 planks together. It takes a little while to perhaps understand that. So that's pounded in. First thing you do is make sure it's loose, top and bottom, because you don't want that to prevent it from coming together. Then you pound it in. You lubricate it with some oil, and it goes in. And that's the result. So everything is fastened. These are 1 shaku apart, and on the inside of the boat, in between, is another dovetail key. So they're alternating, inside and outside, 5, soon, half a foot apart. There's, so that's fastening the bottom to the bottom here, you saw before, to the sides. Then there are these timbers, bow and stern, that fill in the bow and stern. And there's inside the boat. And I was working my way around the boat, I think 39 dovetail keys all the way around the boat, inserting them. and that's the bow. Okay, with some cedar spikes, cedar pegs, trunnels that get trimmed off later for good measure. And that's it, no metal fastenings. And also, interestingly, notice the side planks are book matched. And Japanese boat builders you build a boat from a single log. And the keel comes out of the center of the log. The garboards come out of the next two planks either side of the center. The shear planks come out of the next two planks either side of the garboard. So the boat is built symmetrically from the log. So you can see it.
Are
Right.
those keys glued or no?
No glue.
So you could disassemble this.
No, I don't think so. Because I was on the island and I found a derelict Sabani, and one of the keys had worked its way half out, and I thought, what an awesome souvenir. And I couldn't pull it out.
Disassemble like doing some damage at the keys and that.
Yeah.
Is it the same wood as the garboards?
No, so the boat is cedar, and this is called chage. It's a rock hard. It's like maple. So yeah, it's a hardwood key in a soft wood. So that's really what gives it. The cedar can crush and lock it in place. You can't talk about Okinawa without really bringing up World War II. The island I was on with my teacher, a little 3 miles wide by 4 miles long, was one of the fiercest battles during World War II in the Battle of Okinawa. The Americans wanted it because it had an airfield on it, and the Japanese did not want to lose it. And it was my teacher was a teenager. He lost his 2 older brothers, and his father put the rest of the family in the boat, the Sabani. They paddled to the main island and hid in the jungles for 3 months. And they only came out when they were sure that the battle was over. 3/4 of the island's population was lost. That's the civilian population. But the Americans got the island. These are American fighter planes at the airfield. That's the mountain that dominates the center of the island. And these are drop tanks, aluminum gasoline tanks that fighter planes could drop if they got in a dogfight, so they had better maneuverability, but it extended their range. So these fell by the thousands all over Okinawa, and the Okinawans made boats out of them. And there is a whole, in fact, the museums in Okinawa have this. And this is in the Ejima Museum. And these are called, fune, boat is fune or bune. These are called tanko bune, tank boat. And I actually met a 93-year-old fisherman while I was on the island who's still using one. So, but now these are just found in museum collections for the most part. The boat's baler. That's carved from a single piece of hard pine. And actually my teacher told me an interesting anecdote. That curve perfectly fits the inside of our boat. Sabani are among the most difficult boats to sail. The Okinawans did not use outriggers like the rest of the Polynesians. And I had one memorable sail on a Sabani that ended with a capsize. And I describe sailing a Sabani as a cross between windsurfing and log rolling. They are incredibly unstable. And how these fishermen did it is beyond me. But my teacher was very proud of his traditional heritage. And he pointed out to me, he claimed he was the only man who could still make these. He said, you know what ruined that for us was, after the war, there were so many army helmets laying around. They made perfect bails. But he told me a great story about his father, who was fishing alone and caught a 12-foot shark, killed it, but couldn't bring it in the boat. And he finally realized, and he capsized the boat under the shark and bailed the boat and had the shark in the boat. And actually, the Okinawans had fishing techniques that actually, you capsized your boat in certain situations. So to be able to bail the boat is extremely important, yes.
And that handmade thing, what, did he use abrasives at all to finish it?
Yeah, so you may have seen, you see the belt sander up there.
Yes.
I had not met this man before I went to Okinawa. It was all set up through intermediaries and curators and things. And to my amazement, I arrive in Okinawa and he is half paralyzed from a stroke. He'd had a terrible stroke about 5 years earlier. He could only use one hand. So you saw grinders and things. So I used the hand tools, and he couldn't use any of his traditional tools anymore.
Douglas, you said that's pine. It looks like a hardwood.
Well, they call it a hard pine. That's its definition. Right now, the Japanese, I think it's called mokoku. The Japanese name for that, I don't know. But it was dense. It was very dense material. And there's launch day. There's my teacher. And Okinawan religion is all female-based. How do you say that? Not matrilineal. Matriarchal, thank you, that's it. And she is a shaman. She was a 94-year-old shaman. And she performed the launch ceremony, though I never quite figured this out because these are very Shinto motifs in the ceremony, but that was launch ceremony in our boat. And here's a shot of the Sabani race about to start a few years ago. So this is really, you'll see you can see older restored boats, and you see brand new boats. And now, there are now, since I did this apprenticeship, there's now a new female boat builder, currently building boat as we speak, and 2 or 3 new young male builders of Sabani. So my teacher is too ill, he's no longer active. One other guy is too ill, and there's just one of the old guard that's still building boats.
Do you know anything about the history of the sailing rig that they use?
Well, my teacher told me that he felt Okinawan culture was a hybrid of Polynesian and Chinese culture. So that the fully battened sail is straight out of China. Okay. The red color is an homage to, in the old days, the Okinawans would preserve their sails with pig's blood, which was done, I was just reading, I think the Vikings did something similar to that. So. Now in the tsunami zone, these boats, I took this picture in 2004, which is 7 years before the disaster. These were probably all destroyed. But after the tsunami, I reached out first to people I knew in the region if they were okay, and then I began to think that with this enormous loss of material culture, it would be important to document. You see how these boats are all very similar to one another. These are the most common boat. And by the way, that coastline that was struck, that coastline had more wooden boats than any place else in Japan. And it was all wiped out. So it took me 5 years to raise the funding. That is the hardest part of Japanese boat building, raising the funding. But I eventually got to go and apprentice with this builder. And I actually took a young woman, an American woman, Angela Robbins. Her parents lived in Whitefield, and she grew up in this region and spoke the local dialect. And her presence was invaluable to me because they speak a very difficult dialect in Tohoku. And my teacher was, I would have been lost trying to understand him. Not that he said much, because he didn't. So there's the bottom. There's bending the bottom. We propped it, it's about 2 inches thick. We propped it under his house, we built a fire, and we put the stones on the end, and you see these were all cut and saved, and every 15 minutes he put in a shorter prop. And so he just let it settle down. It took 90 minutes. And we kept splashing water to keep that from burning. We bent the bottom, and he used no drawings, just memorized dimensions, and he wouldn't say a word, and so, I was scrambling to write down and record all this, which is pretty typical of what I do.
Did he put the lines on?
Yes, he would put the lines down. I just sort of followed him. And this was an interesting moment. We were at a point where, and it's a good thing I was thinking, again, even as a documentarian, you gotta think, because he's not gonna help you. At one point I realized, what he needs next is a planking belt. Where's that? How's he going to get that? I gotta know how he's going to get that. And had I just gazed out the window, I would have missed this. He picked up my bevel gauge. He walked over to that beam. He slapped it up there. He adjusted it. He walked away. And I thought, what the heck did he just do? Every bevel for that boat is recorded on a beam in the shop. But what's in some ways even more instructive is, he didn't tell me that. He knew I was there, why I was there. He totally bought into documenting his work, but even so, it wasn't his job. If I couldn't figure it out, that's my problem. So that was an object lesson. But all the bevels in the boat are there. So I did drag him back and say, you tell me. What's that one, that one, that one, and that one. So I did manage to get that out of him, but reluctantly. You know, he thought that was a real waste of his time, and he made that clear.
If he used your bevel square, what would he normally have used?
He had his own bag, he just grabbed mine, it was handy, so he just grabbed mine. So there we are, dirt floor shop, the props. Now, it's quiz time. The boat has the overhanging stern, there's the transom. So one day, my teacher pulled a tape measure and made a mark right there. And he took his saw and he cut an angle. And then he walked over to the other side of the boat and he pulled the same dimension. And he sat there and I could tell he was aiming the saw on the first angle to match the other side. But the question is, how did he get that in?
Same as the transom?
No, that's a good one. Yeah, no, they're both beveled, but no. No, actually, you can see the transom is steeper.
Being in his house?
No, he made no marks. Yes?
Possibly vertical when the boat's in the water, or something about being in the water?
Well, no, how did he get that angle to cut it? That's my question. How did he know that angle? He did no measurement down here. He didn't put any bevel gauge there. How did he get that angle?
How significant is that?
Oh, it's important to him, and we don't question it.
He had a mark on the wall behind us.
Now, don't get on my case for, throwing that quiz at you. Remember what I said early on? Powers of observation. Powers of observation. You should have seen that. I know that's just a little tiny corner of the image, but you should have seen it. Speaking of observation, my Tokyo teacher taught me his way of sharpening. And he said, you take the plane blade, and on the bevel, you go to the sharpening stone, and you make 35 strokes. Then you turn it over, and you flatten the back with 5 strokes. And weeks into the project with him, he was working at the other end of the shop. My plane was dull, it was time to sharpen. And I went to the front of the shop, was our sharpening setup. I got down on my knees, and I went, 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 16, I guess, 17, 18. And I turned the blade over, and from the back of the shop he said, that was 32 strokes. Start over. Powers of observation, okay? All right, our boat nearing completion and finished on launch day. So, and there we are. That's me out with a fisherman rowing it around. I will say to you, if you travel to Japan, the tsunami region is still there are still people in refugee housing out there. It was an incredibly sobering experience to live there for the course of this project. I urge you, if you travel in rural Japan, it is one of the most beautiful parts of Japan. And certainly the people there deserve to not just be remembered for that disaster, but and it's a wonderful, wonderful place, and they love where they live. Very, very interesting, northern Japan. So go visit your sister state of Aomori, though this is Iwate Prefecture, just south of there. And a year after that project, I went to this institution, the Takenaka Carpentry Tools Museum in Kobe, which should be on everybody's list of places to visit. This is one of the most superb museums in the world, devoted to carpentry tools. And they set up a temporary boat shop for me, and I built the exact same boat as a demonstration. Okay. So here's my boat going away, and it was a very popular exhibit. We had a lot of people, and I taught a series of boat building workshops. And to my amazement, and to the utter amazement of the museum, they had to stop registration at 60 people. So there's this wellspring of interest. So you see, we were doing the saw fitting with participants, and anyway, it was really great. And I'm hoping to do more of this in Japan if I can, and here. And there's the same boat. It's my wife in the bow, and I'm at the sculling oar with a couple friends.
With the saw fitting, is there anything else racing those two planks together? Other
No, there's a huge load though
Okay.
on that overhead. That's why you need a strong shop beam work overhead.
Douglas?
Yes.
When you're doing the teaching at the museum, do you use words, or do you have them observe, or what do you do when you're...
Can you hold that thought out? Yeah. Initially, I teach in a very Western way, and I am migrating toward a very Japanese way. And I'll come back to that, I promise. So, a bit about this. These extreme apprenticeships and this enormous pressure that you're put under, and just all of the privations, really, of that process. One thing that can be said is, it produced, whatever your complaint about it is, it produced craftspeople of incredible skill. This man spent his life building 20-foot fishing boats. He built this bent wood vase. He built this inlaid wooden valise. If you said to him, oh, you're a sashimono craftsman. Sashimono just means like small wooden things. He would say, absolutely not. This is crap. I'm an amateur, that's nothing. That's my hobby. I'm a boat builder. But that accumulated skill and wisdom, he's Japan's only builder of these. He told me that it was his life's work, he said, to, quote, rediscover the secrets of Japanese shipbuilders. These are Edo-era ships, so this is basically 1600s, 1700s, 1800s Japan, when Japan was cut off from the outside world. So no ocean-going vessels. These are coastal traders. These are like the schooners of Maine. These are exactly like the schooners of Maine. These just went around the coastline carrying cargo. There's a historic photo. That's a load of rice piled up on deck. Okay. The common name for these vessels is Sengoku Bune. Sengoku Bune. Sen means 1,000. Koku is a traditional measure of rice. One koku will feed one adult for 1 year. Sengoku Bune boat. 1,000 koku ship. And I was lucky enough to be in the shipyard. This is his 4th and final ship. Built 4 of these. And I happened to be staying nearby, and I got to stay in the shipyard right before launching. So the overhanging stern, the massive rudder, which can be lifted up into that slot, a look at the bow. Again, no internal framing, just cross beams, edge-fastened planking. These are really just big little boats. The technology between Japan's small boats and ships is almost interchangeable.
What's the length of that boat?
This boat is 100 feet long, 100 tons.
How do they scarf the planks?
They would do kind of a bite scarf, a step scarf. I don't know if we'll see an image of a scarf like that. I don't have any boat images of it. Inside, this is inside the cabin. This is the capstan to raise the rudder. There's the rudder post to lift the rudder up. And there she is under sail. The shipwright gathered a crew to build this boat. In 2006, they launched, and it took them, gotta get my numbers right. They built this boat in 11 months with 15 shipwrights, average age 69. And it was $3 million.
Very similar to a dhow that I see in the Middle East.
The shear, the amount of shear, yeah. So the Japanese sails, the traditional sails are unique. They're vertical panels and they're loosely woven together. You can see the gaps between them. And that's, you try to imagine how to reef that. Also, all the sheets, multiple sheets. That's a big plus versus our square sails with just a sheet at either corner. Because you can really control the sail shape. In fact, this photo was taken during sailing trials, and they're close hauled, trying to find out if these can actually make weather. Can they sail to weather? And they can. They could. They could make upwind progress.
No centerboard.
No centerboard. There, in lieu of a centerboard, you have this box here, so you get a little bit of leeway there as well as the rudder.
And why would you need to pull the rudder up?
Coming into shallow, they beach these. They would beach these. Yeah.
Looks
So
like you're towing
when the
it.
wind picks up, the sail spills the wind. Historic photo. Okay, so that's the Japanese. Actually, that man told me that he was able to scale, get a lot of his dimensions, because that panel width never changed historically. That was a standard sail panel width, and he said it was great. I looked at old photographs and paintings, I just could scale it. I always had a scale in the photograph, the sail panel width.
What was the material of the sail?
That sail was canvas. That sail was canvas. Okay, so this is my most recent apprenticeship, the cormorant fishing boats. So cormorant fishing has a 1,300-year history in Japan. Today, it's all done for tourists. So you get in a spectator boat, which are also really lovely wooden boats, and you wait for the sun to go down, and the cormorant fishermen come along with, there's the bird on the leash. They have about half a dozen birds. Other birds are on the gunnel, and a big basket with fire, and that attracts the fish, the ayu, which is a delicacy in Japan. The birds get the ayu, you drag the birds back aboard, and you squeeze the fish out of their mouths. When you buy ayu, if you're lucky enough to be in a cormorant community, you can always tell if your ayu was caught by a cormorant because its beak punctured its spine when they grabbed it. And you have to pay extra for a fish that came out of a bird's mouth. Those are more expensive. So, I worked with this man, Mr. Seiichi Natsu, 85 years old, and I had been asking to work with him for 15 years. And every time I asked him, he said no. 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 And I kept dutifully visiting him, no. And the last time I asked him, this was 2017, I saw him in, I'm going to say 2013 or 14, and he said, you know what, I'm too old to do it. I can't do it anymore. I'm not physically able to do this. And so then we kept the conversation going, and he said, oh, maybe my apprentice would teach you. You could apprentice with my apprentice. And so we started that conversation with his apprentice. That fell through, and when Nasu heard about it, he contacted me and he said, then I'll teach you. But he said, here's the deal. I can't do any of the physical work. I'm going to lay the lines down. I'm going to tell you how to do techniques, but you have to do all the physical labor. So this is a neat video. The cormorant fishing boat has almost 1,000 nails in it. Nasu insisted every nail had to pass through my mouth. And you'll see him do it. He believed every nail has to be licked. It has to be wet before you put it in. But he does something in this little video that's also quite interesting. You'll see how tired he is just putting in one nail. Watch him lick it. Japanese boat builders they play a rhythm when they put in nail. Natsu's actually not the best. I had a teacher in Urayasu who was really pretty amazing. And there's actually, and if you gave me your email address, I'm going to send you some YouTube videos of another boat builder doing it, and also another craftsperson doing this percussion in his work. And we talk about work songs, and there may be kind of a tradition in Japan of a percussive work thing, tool thing. But the rationale is that the nail, when you're edge nailing, you're at great risk of splitting the plank. And so you need to modulate how fast that nail goes in. So dun, 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 dun. One of the curious things is, two of my teachers did this, and they both said the same thing to me. They said, you can't copy my rhythm. My rhythm is my signature. You have to come up with your own rhythm. And so that was a little piece we had to get past. But
if you were to split it, how would you repair it?
ooh, if you rip, you just don't. I've never seen anybody split a plank. I think they'd have to abandon it. I really, yeah. There was a moment early in this project. So Nasu came in Monday through Friday for about 7 hours. I worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day to build the boat.
Yes.
Because I had a limited window of time. At the very first day, Nasu said to me, you'll never build this in 2.5 months. He thought I'd take 4 months, but I did it in 2.5 months. Early in the project, I was doing the bottom. I was at the tail end of a hot, hard day, and Nasu said, you got that plank on at the wrong angle, slightly wrong angle. And he looked at me and he said, do you want to fix it or not? You can leave it. As exhausted as I was, I knew he was testing me. And I said, no, I'll take it off and we'll put another one. Or put it on again, the right angle. And Nasu said, see you in the morning. And he shuffled off to home, and I was there till dark, right? And 2.5 months later, at the launching, he came up to me and he said, congratulations. He said, you're amazing. You know, I didn't think you could do it in 2.5 months. And he said, you remember that plank? He said, had you not replaced that, I would have always worried about it. And then he said to me, and I thought, oh, that's kind of amusing. And then he said to me, and I would have worried about it because that plank would have always reflected poorly on me. You know, because he knew. Nobody in Gifu remembers Douglas Brooks, but they remember Nasu taught Douglas Brooks. So, yeah, these craftsmen take this seriously. So anyway, there's our bottom. And that second or third one from the top is my screw-up that I fixed. That's not perfectly flat. What I got wrong was we were trying to build that bottom with a slight curvature. And I missed that angle. I did get it right. So notice that's all rough lumber. And then Nasu had a tradition of weighing down the bottom with stones as well, boulders as well as props. Transom at either end, and the transom is peaked. No clamps. Nasu had about 100 of these dogs as well as the props. The whole thing, he was a master of holding things together with his props. And now we're putting on, getting the planking, and you see all the edge nails? Okay? And notice, there is no internal framing. I think it was 969 nails, yes.
Are those forged or cut?
They are forged. They were blacksmith made. They're blacksmith made. Yeah.
Is there anything between the planks and the transom?
No.
Just one on one?
Fit with the handsaws. Everything's fit with the handsaws.
How are the staples, you drill a little hole, how do they,
Just just hammered in. Just hammered in and then knocked out. Yeah. And he's making a quick cut at the bow. Stern. I planed the entire boat by hand. 42 feet long. It was all finished with a hand paint. And that's the only beam.
What do you infill your chisel marks on?
Chisel mark.
It's like where you put the nails in. You put the little-
Oh, that's a wooden plug.
That's a wooden plug.
That's the only significant thing Nasu-san did. He sat, you know, he had to kill time until he needed to do something, the next step, the next lines. He would sit with the scraps and an axe, and he made all the plugs. And in fact, we built this at a furniture school. Nasu had lost his own workshop in a flood. And so this furniture school, we put up a temporary workshop. And I asked the furniture students, look, jig this up. They're all this little tapered trapezoid. Just jig this up and manufacture these for me on the table saw. And they, you know, the students came back a few hours later with this box with, you know, 1,000 plugs. And Nasu, and I said, look, Mr. Nasu, because I was so stressed about the time thing, you know, couldn't sleep at night because of the time thing. And Nasu picked up the first machine plug, dropped it in the box. Anyways, and then the tradition in Gifu is that a boat upon launch is capsized 3 times. 3 is an auspicious number in Asia, Buddhism. And so that's what we did. We rolled the boat 3 times, and the belief is a boat capsized at launch will never capsize again. So we're just starting to roll it over. Now, so we're winding down here. My Middlebury College class. So I've been teaching boat building here in the U.S. I want to get back to your question about learning. And my goal in my college boat building class, this is a 1-month class, 15 students, needless to say they've never even built a birdhouse, is to, as closely as we can, adhere to the Japanese system, and we have a silent classroom. And our launching, we do a traditional Shinto launching ceremony, and because it's January in the state of Vermont, we launch, and the Middlebury has a gorgeous swimming pool, we launch in the swimming pool. That is a riverboat from near Kyoto. That's a boat I've taught a couple of times. This is my second class, and this is a 27-foot riverboat from Niigata Prefecture, and they're all looking happy and relieved, and then we're in the pool. Okay. And this is my most recent class 1 year ago. So she's chiseling, setting the chisel to meet the mortise. Okay, get ready to edge nail this material together. And a student planing all by hand from rough lumber. You see the plugs, the wooden plugs are inserted. And this is a second boat we built, a little one, saw fitting. And then our little guy, the Agano River, they also use the dovetail keys. You see one in the transom. And our big boat. And we managed, it's the only boat we built, we managed to get the entire class in the boat at one time.
These are all Middlebury students?
These are all Middlebury students. Yeah, do you want to sign up? I've had people ask me if they can break these change. I am going to, another reason to have your email address, I'm going to be teaching this class at Bates College in April. And I'm planning on having like a 1-day open house. And we'll also have a Shinto launching. We can do it at the Bates has a pond. So if people are interested, I'll let you know about that open house. Pardon me?
Did you flip them?
No, the students happily flip them. But that's because they're, you know, they're naughty.
Is that native cedar?
No, this is pine. So in America, particularly in the Northeast, I can't get, the only wide species I can get that's anything like the material I can get in Japan is pine. So that's what we use. And it's inexpensive. So there's our 2 boats from last year. They're currently on display in the Middlebury College Library. So I'm truly wrapping up, I promise. Look at the time. I got word that a foundation approved my grant request to fund my 8th apprenticeship. And I'm going to go back to Japan in November to build one of these. This is a boat builder on the Sea of Japan. Bancho-san, and at 79, he is the youngest boat builder I know. I actually approached 3 other boat builders who all told me they were too old to work. But Bancho-san, I've known him for a few years, and I'm very intrigued by this style because I've got a better picture of it. It's very interesting construction. This is just a small workboat. This interesting box-type construction at the bow. So there's the bottom, there's the stem, the garboard planks are on, but they go to this box setup. And I've not done that, and so it's an opportunity to actually do that, see that in action, see it again down here. The bad news from the foundation is they only gave me half the money I requested. And so I am, that's another reason I took your email addresses. The plan is to try a crowdfunding. I've never done it, but we've got to find $10,000. And I'm also going to be bringing with me the education director of the apprentice shop in Rockland, because they've agreed to work with me on creating a boat building exchange program in Japan. So I'm going to bring her with me. She'll get exposure to this. We've got to raise big money for that, but our hope is to create a program where we can take American boat builders to Japan, build Japanese boats, maybe ultimately bring Japanese boat builders here to Maine. So that's in my future. And I'll happily take questions. Thank you very, very much.